Welcome to lecture number 58, Historical Topic 6.4, The New South. The theme is American and National Identity. The learning objective says, explain how various factors contributed to continuity and change in the New South from 1877 to 1898. And the first of two key concepts says, despite the industrialization of some segments of the Southern economy, a change promoted by Southern leaders who called for a New South, agriculture based on sharecropping and tenant farming continued to be the primary economic activity in the South. This vision for the New South was proposed by Henry Grady. He was a newspaper editor and called for a capitalist industrialized society to develop in the South. He was trying to make the Southern economy be more like the Northern economy. However, there were still elements of white supremacy in Henry Grady's vision. He had made several speeches in which he wanted to keep African Americans as second-class citizens and whites on top of the social hierarchy. These racial views present a continuity from the Old South during Reconstruction and the antebellum before that. There is limited success in some cities in industrialization. Richmond becomes the center for the tobacco industry and Memphis for the lumber industry. But a lot of these developments are being financed by northern banks, so all of the profits are leaving the region. Thus, they can't be used to reinvest into other parts of the southern economy. There's also no expansion in education, so the southern population continues to stagnate. There's still a dependency on cotton, there's still sharecropping and tenant farming, which keep people tied to the land in a form of involuntary servitude. The map on the bottom left shows where wealth is located in the 19th century in the United States, and most of the wealth is concentrated in the north and in the northeast. The only areas in the South where there are larger amounts of wealth are along the Mississippi River Valley, in the port cities, and a few other scattered cities throughout the South. So despite its push to industrialize, the South is still largely agricultural. The next key concept is split up into two parts and deals with African Americans in the South. The first part says the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. The 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson concerns Omar Plessy, who with a group called the Committee of Citizens attempted to challenge the laws that segregated railway cars in New Orleans. Plessy was 1/8 black and used his ambiguous skin color to challenge the segregatory policy. He deliberately sat in the white car and alerted people of what he was doing to get arrested. He appeals his arrest to challenge the law, continued appeals send it all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court holds that separate accommodations do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. All of the justices were in accordance with the majority decision except for just one, Justice John Marshall Harlan. In his dissenting opinion, he calls out the law specifically, saying that the only intent was to segregate blacks and whites, and to deny the equality to blacks using this segregatory law. In his dissent, he writes, everyone knows that the statute in question had its origin and the purpose not so much to exclude white people from railroad cars occupied by blacks, as to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons. The thing to accomplish was, under the guise of giving equal accommodation for whites and blacks, to compel the latter to keep to themselves while traveling in railroad passenger coaches. No one would be so wanting in candor as to assert the contrary. Despite Harlan's dissent, new legal doctrine of separate but equal is created, and any new segregation law that is challenged is put to the separate but equal standard. The separate but equal doctrine will be used through 1954. It's not until Brown versus the Board of Education that separate but equal is struck down in a case that challenged racial segregation in public schools. That court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, found that separate accommodations are inherently unequal. The last part of the key concept says, facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continued to fight for political and social equality. Civil rights gains were continuously attacked through the end of the 19th century, and the Plessy decision was by no means the start of it. The civil rights cases in 1883 were a collection of 5 Supreme Court cases that collectively weakened the 14th and 15th Amendments. All the cases challenged the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and the courts deemed it unconstitutional, using the rationale that Congress could not punish discrimination by private businesses or individuals. Similarly to Plessy, some of the decisions were later overturned as a result of the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The scientific theories of race that the key concept talks about is social Darwinism, and we covered in the previous period how Darwin's theory of evolution was used to justify racism and discrimination in the late 19th century. The reformers that the key concept refers to were all African American advocates that sometimes disagree on their methods for campaigning for equality. Frederick Douglass, who was active through the majority of the 19th century from the antebellum into the 1890s, works to mentor the next generation of reformers. He He worked closely with Ida B. Wells in the 1890s when they presented at the 1893 World Columbia Exposition in Chicago. He makes one of his most memorable speeches while presenting a pamphlet that he and Wells had published called The Negro Problem. He said, "Men talk of the Negro problem. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution. We Negroes love our country. We fought for it. We ask only that we be treated as well as those who fought against it." Douglass calls out the former Confederates that are still in the South who have regained their previous influence, while blacks in the South had the promise of equality from Reconstruction stripped away, blaming America for failing to uphold that promise. Wells was a journalist and became an advocate for African Americans in the issue of lynchings. In her initial study on lynchings, she aggregated all instances of lynchings throughout the South to prove that it is not isolated incidents in various states. She proved that they were targeted attacks against African Americans who were becoming economically prosperous and posed competition to whites. They were used as a form of intimidation to maintain white supremacy. W.E.B. Du Bois was a graduate of Harvard and called for the immediate action on social equality. He wanted fast and drastic action as it was what was due under the new constitutional amendments. He was the leader of the Niagara Movement, which created the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The organization was active and continues to be active through the present day in challenging discriminatory laws. Du Bois's foil or counterpart would be Booker T. Washington. He was also active at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, but he wanted to take a more pragmatic approach. In his Atlanta Compromise speech, he wants African Americans to take the jobs that are available to them now in the South and achieve economic equality first before they start asking for social equality. He was trying to have a more compromising position for African Americans, to put up with the social inequality in the form of Jim Crow laws, and then eventually, once they become economically equal to whites, they could ask for that social equality. The problem was that without the social equality, it was really difficult for African Americans to become economically equal to whites. The most common economic opportunities for Black Americans in the late 19th century were sharecropping and tenant farming, which more often resulted in a cycle of debt than in economic parity. Finally, here is the recap. There are attempts at industrialization in the South. They have limited successes. The segregation became constitutional through the case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and a new wave of African American reformers advocate for equality. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.